Reverend William Adams had two slaves that we know of, Tom and Phoebe. And so I really wanted to find out more about Tom and Phoebe because I thought it was important that we incorporate information about their lives to interpretation of Abigail Adams's birthplace. And so I did find out some information, and last year we had a program on Tom and Phoebe. We also put it within the context of New England slavery as a whole. And so this is, our program today is a second in a series on early New England slavery, and we hope to continue this discussion because there really is so much to talk about, and it's very relevant, obviously, in the world we live in today. So most people think of New England as the birthplace of the abolitionist movement, which it was, but it also has a very long history of slavery. The first slaves came here in Massachusetts in the 1630s, and Massachusetts was actually the first colony to legalize slavery in 1641 with its Body of Liberties. And of course, as many of us know, many New England merchants made a lot of money on the slave trade. So, of course, the numbers here were a lot smaller than in the South. In Massachusetts, during the colonial period, the population of enslaved blacks was about 2%, but these numbers could be much higher in urban areas like Boston. Boston could have as much as 10% of its population being enslaved. And there are so many stories there that should be told and that we should be talking about today. So a lot of people think that New England slavery was definitely different than in the South. For the most part, there were small numbers of slaves that a few individuals had. It wasn't a large-scale plantation system as in the South. Although in Rhode Island, there were several large farms that did have a very similar system to the plantation system. And Rhode Island had as many as the colony had as many as 6% of its population was enslaved African Americans. So the story there is a little bit different. We tend to think of the northern slavery being more benevolent than slavery in the South, but this isn't necessarily the case. Of course, any system where people are denied their personal liberty is abhorrent. The punishment here that African Americans received could also be just as severe and horrifying as in the South. And one of the most tragic aspects of slavery, both in the North and the South, was that families were very frequently split up. Spouses were separated from each other and parents were separated from children. And you just need to look at historical records of the time, including newspapers, to see evidence of slave sales where whole families would be put up for sale, and the advertisement will actually say they can be sold as a unit or sold separately. So given this really demoralizing, dehumanizing, crushing system, I think it's amazing that so many enslaved African Americans were able to rise above their circumstances in different ways. And today we're focusing on the ways that they did that through artistic expression. And we're really fortunate to have these two fascinating stories about these slave artists right in our own backyard. We have today Paula Bagger, who's a member of the board of directors of the Hingham Historical Society. We'll be talking about Prince Demah. He was one of the very first slave African American artists. And then we have Briton Hammon, who published what might be the first autobiography by an African American. And so Paula actually recently co-authored an article about Prince Demah for the magazine Antiques. And Aaron Doherty will be talking about Briton Hammon. And Aaron is the executive director of the 1699 Winslow House and Cultural Center in Marshfield. It's another historical gem. And Aaron has done significant research on Briton's life and has spoken about Briton on a number of occasions. So I'm going to be asking Paula and Aaron a series of questions. And this panel part of the discussion will last about 45 minutes or so. And then we're going to open up the conversation to audience questions. So I guess we should begin by talking about the individuals. So just, Aaron, can you tell us how you first found out about Briton and just tell us a little bit about his life?
Absolutely. And I also want to say to everybody who came out today, thank you. This is a fantastic turnout. As Michelle said, I'm the director of the Winslow House down in Marshfield, Massachusetts. If anybody has never had the pleasure to visit us, please do. We're closed in the winter, but we will be opening up again once it's warm enough to get our plumbing back, so sometime in May, perhaps. One of the first stories I heard when I got my current job as the director of the Winslow House was that of Briton Hammon, this 18th century man who was certainly partially African, of African ancestry, and maybe native ancestry as well. One of the things that the board of directors wanted to tell me about was Briton's contribution to the field of slave narrative, the field of African American literature. This guy who lived in the house sometime in the 1740s and again in the 1760s had this fascinating story where he goes out to sea still as a slave. He travels down to the Caribbean. He is captured by Native Americans. He is enslaved for a second time by the Spanish. He serves in the British Navy. He goes and he recuperates after a time down over at the Greenwich Naval Hospital in London. And once he finally returns here to New England in the 1760s, local printers up in Boston take notice of his story, and they start to publish it. This one of the first examples of slave narratives eventually ends up about a century later helping to contribute to the rise of the abolitionist movement. And the gentleman who helped to spark this all off lived right there in the Winslow House, right where I get to go and work every single day. There is a particular room in the Winslow House, which I'll be showing you a picture of later on, which we believe was probably the quarters for slaves and servants who were highly placed in the Winslow household back in the 1760s. We think that at some point, this room may have been the home of Briton Hammon, who I'll be talking about in greater depth, greater length a little bit later on in the presentation. So to answer your question, that's when I first heard about him, and it's a fascinating story.
And Paul, please tell us about how you first found out about Prince Demah.
Well, sure. I'm going to stand up if that's okay, so I can see out over all of you. Over on the two easels over there, you'll see the reproduction of two paintings. And if any of you have ever been to the Old Ordinary House Museum in Hingham, these are on the walls of the Old Ordinary and have been on the walls since the 1920s. They were given to us by Susan Barker Willard, one of the founders of the Hingham Historical Society and a major benefactor. They had come down in her family. I think several generations of fifth grade students in the Hingham schools have been trooped past these paintings and told that they are paintings of a loyalist couple from Marlborough, Massachusetts, Christian and Henry Barnes, who were, because Henry was involved, was a merchant involved in a trade with Britain, were forced to flee back to England in 1775 when the British Army withdrew from Boston. If you look at them a little more closely, you'll see that both of the paintings are damaged. There's a slash over Christian Barnes's breast, and there's a sword or a bullet hole in Henry's chest. And the story, at least, is that these were put in the paintings by the Marlborough committees of correspondence, the Patriots, after they left, after the Barneses left, to get the last word, as it were. But that's not actually how I came to know about Prince Demah. We also have up in the archives of the Hingham Historical Society a remarkable group of letters, a set of correspondence between Deborah Barker of Hingham, a young woman in Hingham, and her Aunt Barnes, who was this woman, Christian Barnes. And I started reading the letters because I'd seen the paintings, and they keep talking about an old woman named Daphne. And I looked at the Barnes' family tree. There are no Daphnes in the Barnes' family tree. And after a little bit of digging, I discovered that Daphne was Christian and Henry Barnes' slave who had been left behind on the Marlborough estate when Christian and Henry went back to England. And Christian Barnes writes all the time, what's going on with Daphne, how's she doing, is she keeping body and soul together? Deborah says, oh yes, Daphne comes down, spends the summer with us here in Hingham. It's a remarkable set of letters. And that took me down to the Library of Congress in Washington, where I found Christian's letters back to Deborah. We just had Deborah's to Christian. And I learned that Daphne had a son who was a very talented painter. And so, of course, cha-ching, I had a great idea. When we were given these paintings, we were told they were by John Singleton Copley, but the Museum of Fine Arts disabused us of that fact in about 5 minutes when, when we took the paintings in back in the 1930s. So I became very interested in trying to make the connection, and I learned everything I could about Prince. And for right now, I think I'll give you the timeline of what we know about him. He was baptized, he and his mother were baptized together in Trinity Church in Boston in 1745. He was also buried out of Trinity Church, Boston in 1778, and that record suggests that he was probably born in 1740 or 1741. We know nothing about him now, although we're going to work on it, until 1769, when he was purchased by the Barneses. So the Barneses owned his mother, and they purchased him in 1769. In all likelihood, he was sold away from the family when he was a baby. And the Barnes purchased him because they knew he was a talented painter. They knew him clearly from the correspondence. Christian had already sat for him for a painting before they bought him. And then they bought him with the eye towards developing his talents as a portrait painter. They allowed him to work on his art, and in 1770-71, they took him to London, where he had painting lessons with a well-known English painter named Robert Edge Pine. He came back to Boston and seemed to have a short period of activity as a commercial portrait painter. And then I think the world fell apart with the Revolution and Christian and Henry leaving. And we know that in early 1777, he joined the Massachusetts militia and served until his death in March of 1778. So I knew a lot, but I still had nothing to connect the paintings to Prince, and that came in 2013 when I did some work with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I'll pick up on that when we talk about the paintings themselves.
So, Aaron, can you tell us about Briton's writings and about their historical significance?
I can. I'm going to go very quickly through and give you the 5-minute story of Briton Hammon, as it were. This is a narrative that goes on for about 13 years or so. It's about 11 pages, so it's a little tiny publication. There's almost nothing to them. About half of his writing, Briton Hammon actually focuses on a 3 or 4 week period during his journey down in the Caribbean, and I will explain why that's significant later on. But just to give you a little bit of background on Briton himself. All right. No known birth date or death date. We know almost nothing about this guy except for what he tells us for his travels between 1747 and 1760. He is a servant, meaning slave, to General John Winslow of Marshfield, Massachusetts. Servant was sort of that euphemism. You're never really sure if Briton is actually receiving wages for the work that he's doing or whether he is a slave. But we are assuming, as he makes references to his good old master, John Winslow, we're assuming that Briton was a slave. Now, in the 18th century, it is not uncommon for New Englanders who own slaves in the winter when no crops are growing in the fields and you have a surplus of labor. If you have any nautically minded slaves in your household, you send them to sea. You go You have them go on trading voyages down to the Caribbean, over to Europe, over to Africa, wherever you think that you can make a profit. Because with all those additional hands that you need to feed in the winter and fewer profits coming in, it makes sense from the perspective of 18th century slave owners to send these people to sea, remove that upkeep, and bring in a little bit of extra money. Now, many of these nautically minded slaves may have actually welcomed the opportunity to see something outside of their very small sphere of existence. Briton Hammon probably didn't know a whole lot about the world outside of his master's estate. We know that he was down in the Caribbean at some point in the previous decade, but maybe he welcomed the chance to go out and see the world, have a little bit of an adventure. Now, on the 25th day of December 1747, Briton Hammon tells us, with the leave of his master, he went from Marshfield with an intention to go a voyage to sea. And he is heading, along with the other crew members of the sloop out of Plymouth, he is heading for Jamaica and the Bay of Campeche. It's close to the Yucatan Peninsula, down near the Mexican coast. Down in Campeche, they have this really rare and valuable substance called logwood. You can make, if you bring back a ton of this crop, which can be turned into a dye, a servant such as Briton, who wouldn't have made all that much money, you sell a ton of this logwood, and you have the equivalent of 15 years' wages. You have a larger sloop that can fit several tons of this logwood, you're looking at quite a bit of profit. He probably would have split the proceeds between himself, who's actually going to sea and risking his life to get this crop, and his master, John Winslow. So the crew arrives at the Bay of Campeche, they cut logwood, and then on May 25th of 1748, the sloop turns around with its hull full of logwood, and they head back towards British North America. They get towards Florida, and they're going to have a few problems. This is from the narrative. We saw the whole number of Indians advancing forward and loading their guns, upon which the mate said, "My lads, we are all dead men." Inspiring words. June 1748, the sloop that Britain is on strikes a reef on the shoals of Cape Florida. Part of the crew is going to go for help, and they're going to see a number of what they first take to be rocks advancing towards them. But they're not rocks, they're probably about 24 canoes. And as Britain tells it, they're full of native warriors. They take captive the men who had been sent for help, and then they go for the grounded sloop. Everybody on board the sloop is killed. Briton Hammon is talking about his fellow crewmen being killed with muskets and with hatchets and cutlasses and all sorts of horrible things like that. The natives spare Briton, and they take him back to their camp, and he's going to remain there for about a month, during which, the narrative tells us, he's threatened with torture, with death. The natives are telling him in broken English that they're going to roast him alive, all sorts of horrible things like this. But they never do. After being a guest of these natives for about a month, a Spanish schooner arrives just off the shores of these natives' camp. And as it happens, the captain of the Spanish schooner is an old acquaintance of Briton Hammon, a guy by the name of Romand. Who would have thought? I mean, of all the coincidences. Turns out that Britain knew this guy, this Spanish ship captain, from what he calls the Last War. He may have had some naval experience in the British Navy and probably encountered the guy sometime in the 1730s. This Romand convinces the natives to let Britain go and let him get up on the Spanish ship, and then the ship turns around and just sails back out to sea. This is in July of 1758. After they make their escape from the natives, Britain is taken down to Havana, which is the capital of the Spanish colony of Cuba. The Florida natives actually follow him down there, and they appear in Havana, and they are demanding Britain's return because they say that they took him captive, fair and square. The Spanish governor is a guy named Francisco Callegal de la Vega, and he gives these natives $10 in exchange for Britain's life. Britain probably was just purchased as a slave for the second time. The natives turn around, go back to their camp in Florida, and Britain is left with the Spanish. He's going to live with the governor in his residence for about 12 months, during which time he has the liberty to walk the streets. He has the opportunity to go out and do his own work and make his own wages, but he's probably still a slave. He's probably still owned by the Spanish governor and no more a free man than he was when he was living back in Marshfield. One day, when he's walking through the streets of Havana, he's captured by a press gang. Just like the English colonies, the Spanish colonies also had these men who would go and seize unwilling sailors to go out to sea and crew the ships of the Spanish Navy. They clap Britain in a close dungeon, as he terms it, and they ask if he would go to sea for the Spanish king, and he says no, upon which they imprison him for 5 years. That seems like a reasonable reaction, don't you think? About 4 years and 7 months after his captivity begins, the governor hears about his plight, and he orders Britain released back into the governor's captivity. By this point, Britain is ready to leave Cuba. It is 1754. He's been here for about 5 years, 5 or 6 years, and he's ready to leave. He tries to escape on board an English ship, but the captain finds him and is afraid of angering the Spanish, so he forces Britain to go back ashore. A couple of years after his captivity has ended in the close dungeon, Britain finally manages to talk his way onto a British ship heading out of Havana and to the nearby colony of Jamaica. Once he gets onto the ship, the HMS Beaver, the Spanish realize that Britain has escaped, along with a number of other people who have managed to elude Spanish custody. And they order the Beaver, this British ship, to release its captives back into Spanish custody. The British sea captain refuses to do so. He says that he is not going to release British subjects back into the hands of the Spanish when the British flag flies over his ship. This is important. Britain is a black man, he is a slave twice over, and he is now being referred to by this British captain as a British subject. For perhaps the first time in his life, he is considered to be a part of something, namely the entire British Empire. He escapes to Jamaica. He seems to enlist on board a British ship that's sailing from Jamaica to London as a part of a convoy for a fleet of British merchantmen. At some point in his journey, he mentions being turned over to a ship called the HMS Arkansas. This implies that he had joined the British Navy. I mentioned earlier he seemed to have some naval experience. Now he's putting it to good use in the service of the country, which for the first time has recognized him as a subject. Now, at some point, to put this in perspective, the 1750s, you've all probably heard of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as it's known worldwide. This is in full swing in the middle of the 1750s. This is not a safe time to be serving in any European navy. But Britain is ordered on board a 74-gun ship of the line called the Hercules. The British Admiralty sends the Hercules down to a French port called La Rochelle. And while there, the Hercules encounters a ship called the Sovereign. 84 guns, bigger than the HMS Hercules. The captain of the ship is actually wounded with shrapnel. He loses a leg. And accounts of this battle have actually filtered into the newspapers back over as far away as Boston. So this was a pretty big battle. Britain himself is wounded in the head by a piece of shrapnel. On May 12, 1759, he's discharged from the Hercules after having served 3 months, and he's transferred to Greenwich Hospital for the recuperation of British sailors. Once again, he's being treated as a British citizen, and not only that, a member of the British Navy. Not a bad step up for a former slave. August to October 1759, he's going to serve as a cook on the Royal Navy ship HMS Captain Martin. But then he's going to fall ill with a fever for 6 weeks, and his medical care basically exhausts the last little bit of money that he has left. Fortunately, being a sailor does not pay well in the 18th century. He's so desperate for work after recovering from this fever that he enlists on a ship that seems to be going down towards the African nation of Guinea. And we think that he was probably going there as a part of a slaving operation. You can imagine the dangers associated with this former slave, a black man, enlisting on a slave ship to go to Africa to basically capture and sell other slaves. This is a very dangerous thing that Britain is doing. However, before the ship leaves, he overhears rumors of a ship bound for his old stomping grounds of Boston. He begs out of the Guinea voyage. He enlists on this other ship as a cook. Now, they go out to sea in the winter of 1760. They've been on the ship for 3 or 4 weeks, and Britain starts to hear rumors of this passenger on board the ship, this General Winslow. When last he saw John Winslow in 1747, 13 years ago, the guy was a lieutenant in the British Army. Since that time, John Winslow has made his name as the hero of the Acadian campaign during the French and Indian War. So he's kind of a big shot back in Massachusetts. As he never knew John Winslow by the name of the title of general before, Britain's not sure if it's his old master or not. So he asks around a little bit, and people tell him it's the general, the hero of the Acadian campaign, the man from Marshfield. According to his narrative, Britain later says that upon hearing this, that this is his old, long-forgotten master, he was so overcome with emotion that he's not able to speak for about 2 hours. He's just so shocked. I'm not sure I believe this. This narrative is actually, if you read it, you'll start to realize it's crafted for an English audience. English audiences did not want to hear about the horrors of slavery and what slaves like Britain may have suffered as essentially property of other human beings. They want to know that their slaves, whether they're free or not, their slaves are happy. I think that Britain, when he loses his voice, I think that Britain is struggling with a decision. He's been at sea for 13 years. He's been away from his old master at Marshfield for 13 years. And during that time, he was threatened by natives. He was imprisoned by the Spanish and sold into slavery for the second time. He served as a member of the British Navy, but then he was wounded and lost all his money. He went back out to sea and made a little bit more money, but then he lost it all again after coming down with fever. He was so desperate for work to bring in just food and lodging that he was thinking about going and enslaving other people like him in order just to make ends meet. I think Britain is struggling with a decision. Is he going to announce himself to John Winslow and go back to the old life that he knew, a life of bondage, but a life that's a little bit more secure than the one he's had for the last 13 years? He's grappling with the decision. Now, I just want everybody to think about this. Think about what it would mean to have this type of a crossroads in your life. And think about what he went through. And you don't need to say, and certainly don't need to tell anybody, but just think about what you yourself would do in Britain's position. Would you go back to the security of Marshfield and slavery, or would you maintain a free but somewhat tenuous existence as a man on the wider Atlantic world in the British Empire? John Winslow does eventually reunite with Briton Hammon. The two of them have what, by all accounts, is a very tearful and very tender reunion on the deck of the ship heading back towards Boston. Briton returns to the Winslow house and probably lives for most of the rest of his life as a slave under John Winslow. Now, one of the last phrases of his narrative, I am freed from a long and dreadful captivity, and am returned to my own native land to show how great things the Lord hath done for me. Technically, he is once again a captive, but once again, this is tailored for an English audience. Now, this is the room that we think Britain may have lived at some point in the 1760s. It is what we refer to in the Winslow house as the servants' quarters. And this is where higher station slaves in the Winslow house probably would have had their lodgings. Based on the fact that Britain was allowed to go to sea, that he was trusted enough to come back, and based on the accounts of his reunion with his master John Winslow in 1760, we think that it's likely that Britain probably would have lived in this room right here. Now, in 1760, Britain's story is picked up by Green and Russell, who are the foremost printers in Boston. English audiences are enthralled with a type of literature called captivity narratives. If you've never heard of them, captivity narratives are basically accounts of people who were imprisoned by natives. You remember Britain's very short, only 3 or 4 week captivity down in Florida. Well, of this 11 or 12 page narrative, half of that length is given over to this very short period of time in Britain's 13-year travels, because it is an example of a captivity narrative. English audiences wanted to hear how the atrocities that certain English troops carried out on the frontier against natives, well, maybe these atrocities were justified, because look how much worse the natives were. Britain's story becomes popular because the natives are threatening him. They're saying they're going to torture him and roast him alive. And English people who are reading this are saying, aha, see, look what they're capable of. But in publishing this captivity narrative, the English also inadvertently create one of the very first slave narratives in American history. Briton Hammon's story is not only the first autobiography of a black American, but it also is the first of the very first type of literature. Later on, slave narratives like those of William Wells Brown, Frederick Douglass, and many, many others are going to bring about the growth of the abolitionist movement, particularly so in Massachusetts. That is why Briton Hammon's story is important, because not only is it an example of a very rare type of literature where we actually get to hear about the stories of men like Briton, who was a slave, a black man in colonial America. It also helps us to realize how long it took and how much work went into bringing about the abolition of the institution of slavery. And I think that was slightly more than 5 minutes, and I apologize, but I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle.
It's fascinating. Paula, can you please tell us about Prince's work?
Sure. There we go. All righty. So this is where we left off. These are these two paintings of Christian and Henry Barnes that are at the Old Ordinary in Hingham. And they were painted, I'll get the suspense over with. They were painted by Prince. Sometime, it had to have been between 1769 when they purchased him and 1775 when they went to England. In all likelihood, they were painted after 1771, which is when Prince returned from his trip to England with Henry Barnes. There's some reason to doubt whether he had in fact done much painting before he went to England. He was before he left, he was working with what they called crayons, which was essentially pastels. Where's the... This is a painting that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was purchased by the Metropolitan in 2010 when they were going to put on a show about the worldwide textile trade. And they purchased this painting not so much on its merits, but because it's a painting of a Scottish textile merchant named William de Goud, who was living in Boston in the 1770s, and because he's wearing an absolutely spectacular banyan. The banyans are these robes, sort of like bathrobes that the gentlemen would wear when they were at home, and I think you can see that William de Goud's got a doozy on. And so I think I've mentioned that at that point, I knew all about Prince, or as much as I've been able to find so far, and I knew I had these paintings, and I was stuck in terms of my research. And it turned out that this painting at the Metropolitan, nope, that's, there it is. Was signed on the back. And on a stretcher across the back of the painting, you see it says W.D., that's William de Goud, at the age of 26, 1773, that's all talking about the subject. Then it says Prince Demah Barnes, and then it says sculpt, and then that's crossed out. And then it says Pinxit, which is Latin, means he painted it. February of 1773. And so when I saw that, I obviously jumped up and down and called the Metropolitan. They had no idea who Prince Demah Barnes might have been, and so we spent a lot of time talking to each other. The upshot of which was that we took our paintings down to New York to have them examined by the conservators at the Metropolitan. And So the first thing that they told us is, they said that all three paintings were by Prince, and they could tell by looking at the brushstrokes. They could tell because all of the canvas had come, essentially out of the same bolt of canvas or whatever. They took X-rays and things like that. But they also said that they were pretty sure that the painting of Christian Barnes is a copy of a now lost painting of Christian Barnes by John Singleton Copley. And making copies of paintings was a very common, and it wasn't like criminal. It was a very common and usual thing that was done back then, because if your daughter was going off to live in France or something, you would have a copy of your painting made so that she could take it with you. It was very common to have multiple copies of paintings done by lesser artists than the original, and they think that that's exactly what this painting is. As an example, the painting on the right is a painting, is a Copley of a woman named Mrs. Alexander Cumming, and you can see that stylistically they're very similar. The style of this painting is, you can imagine that there was a painting by Copley of Christian Barnes. And in fact, in one of her letters, that she says, she writes that in one of her letters that he's taken a copy of my picture, which I think has more of my resemblance than Copley's. So in other words, she was saying that she thought that old Prince might have even improved it a little bit. The other reason they think that it's a copy of a Copley is because, they can tell because they say when you're a copyist, you use very constricted brushstrokes. Because you're not painting freely, you're trying to make it look like something. They also say that he's experimenting with very thick paint. He's trying to do the things that Copley does with shadowing. He's using purple paint under the neck, which isn't the kind of thing that a primitive painter would do. He's obviously, they think, looking at a Copley and trying to figure out how to do it himself, which is kind of exciting. We know that, in fact, Prince, when he got back from Europe, had a little bit of a business as a copyist. This painting on the left, this is rather over-the-top Copley of a woman named Elizabeth Murray Smith, who was Christian Barnes's best friend. This painting is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and we know that Prince copied it because there's correspondence. Elizabeth Murray Smith writes to Christian Barnes saying, Christian writes to Elizabeth saying, if you're here in Boston, could you please stop by? Prince says he's having trouble with the hat. And he wants you to, come by and put the hat on so you can work on the copy a little bit more. And Elizabeth Smith's brother, James Murray, lots of letters. Christian's trying to talk him into getting a copy done by Prince, but no evidence that they were able to close that deal. But he had a bit of a career doing that. Now, these two paintings, Henry Barnes and Mr. de Goud, the people at the Metropolitan think those were painted from life. In other words, he wasn't trying to copy a painting that existed, that these two subjects actually sat for him. And the answer to the question about that lunette around Henry Barnes is that they were able to look at it with X-rays and say, there's more Henry underneath it, but that the hand kind of came out badly. And so he obviously decided that, he didn't want the hand in. And in fact, they say that they think that the same thing is true of Mr. de Goud's pose, that maybe hands were not Prince's almost entirely self-taught painter, but he had trouble with hands. Why is that not moving for me? There we go. Just for a little bit of perspective on Henry, these are two pictures by Robert Edge Pine, who is the British portraitist who he studied under briefly. It's a picture of George Washington and a picture of a prominent Whig politician in England named John Wilkes. One of the great ironies, given that Henry Barnes had to leave this country because of his Tory politics, were that Robert Edge Pine was a flaming radical. And John Wilkes was, in fact, in prison for his politics when that painting was made. And in the 1780s, Robert Edge Pine left England and came over to the United States because his goal was to paint all of the fathers of the American Revolution. He was such a big fan of the American Revolution. So it was sort of odd bedfellows for Henry Barnes. Might have been interesting times for Prince to be studying in his studio. But I also just thought that, they're obviously very different, but the style of the paintings is very similar. This is the painting by the master, Mr. Pine, and by Prince. But the people at the Met said that they were also sure that it was by the same artist because they say that that Prince paints certain parts of the body the same. And they say that the noses are the same and that around the mouth is the same and that it certainly looks like the same artist. He makes the cravats the same, although William has a lovely bejeweled heart where Henry's got a bullet hole. They think that this was a marriage painting because it has that pink heart-shaped brooch, and so they think there's probably a Mrs. de Boot out there somewhere. Oh, and this is the Metropolitan, and just very recently, see up in the corner there, they've made room for prints on the wall of the 18th century room, so I'm happy about that.
So it was in storage when you were doing your research?
It was, and then they brought it up into visible storage, and then finally he's out there with Copley in the room, so I thought that was kind of fun. How do we get out of it? I'll let you take care of that.
There we go.
Thank you.
So let's start with Aaron. So given the many constraints on Briton's time and activities, given that he was a slave, how do you think that he did manage to exercise his creativity in the way that he did?
Well, I don't think Briton ever actually intended to be famous. I think that during his time when he was sailing around from place to place, becoming a captive and being threatened and being enslaved once, twice, however many times it happened during this 13-year period. I think that he was simply observing what happened. He was traveling around. He was seeing the world in greater detail than he had ever had the chance to do so before. I think that it's not until he returned back to New England and he started telling his experiences to some of his neighbors, to his old master, John Winslow, maybe swapping war stories. What was Briton doing during the battle? What was John Winslow doing when he was up in Canada? So on and so forth. I think at this time, he started to realize that what happened to him over the last 13 years, it is something fairly significant. It's something that people may actually want to know about. Perhaps even his master and his master's friends and the other white New Englanders who, up until this point, possibly had never really paid attention to Briton before. I think that his story is something that he doesn't realize until Green and Russell are knocking on his door asking if they can transcribe this story and publish it and put it out into the world so many other English people can read about Briton's experiences. I think he managed to become famous without ever really intending to do so, because he realized he had something really special on his hands. And talk about 15 minutes of fame, people are still going to be talking about him 3 centuries later.
How about Prince?
Well, he was probably in an interesting situation because he was purchased to do his art. So it wasn't a situation in which he had to find a way to do his art. I think the 3 interesting questions about his relationship to his art probably are, first, what happened to his career after the Barneses left? It did appear as if he was heavily dependent on commissions that Christian Barnes, who was a sort of a marketing dynamo, writing letters all the time, were able to get him. Well, one thing that's very interesting is that For years, scholars, art historian scholars have queried about a set of advertisements that appeared in one of the Boston papers, basically monthly throughout 1773, and it says, Negro artist on King Street. You will find a Negro artist of surprising genius who has studied with the best masters in London. He takes faces at very reasonable rates. This has to be Prince. People have speculated of other personalities who it might be, but the reference to the going to the England, it really has to be Prince. It does appear like he had a little bit of a business in Boston on King Street, which is now State Street by the old State House, doing portraits, but that had to have ended not only with the Barneses leaving, but also with the Revolution beginning and everything that happened. Second question is, how did he get to be such a good artist? He clearly had a level of proficiency when the Barneses purchased him. All of the writing says he's entirely self-taught. The people at the Metropolitan say, oh, you don't get that good being entirely self-taught. I said, well, what about John Singleton Copley? He was entirely, they said, well, he was a genius. And I said, well, why can't my guy be a genius too? But there is a question, was he trained in some way, wherever he was before he was purchased by the Barnes? And then the third, and what I think the most interesting thing is what motivated Christian and Henry Barnes? Why did they do this? And one of it is, because this is clearly why they did it. Christian writes in 1769, she says, Henry has purchased Prince not solely with the view of drawing my picture, but I believe he has design of improving his genius in painting and to show him as an artist. One thing that occurs is that I think there was a little bit of it was chic, I think, to have an accomplished slave in 1773. This was the same year that Phyllis Wheatley went to London on her grand tour with her poetry, and there might have been a little Keep Up with the Joneses involved in it. It could have been an economic motive, but that strikes me as unlikely. One of the neighbors wrote a letter that I was also able to find, but basically saying, I don't know why she's doing this. Why would you go to some Negro guy if you can get a Copley yourself? I don't know what she's doing. It may not have been an economic thing. It's possible that it was family. I have not discounted the possibility that Henry was Prince's father, which for various reasons and things that are said in the letters is a possibility. But it really does make us try and look into the relationships amongst these people, which are frankly difficult for us to understand.
So, researching enslaved people definitely poses a number of challenges. So, Aaron, can you start by telling us what types of sources you use to research Briton's life?
Absolutely. One of the major problems that I find with doing any research into 18th century slaves, and you probably had much the same sort of problem, many of these slaves, if they were literate, and that is an if they were literate, there's always the danger that anything that they say is going to be pretty liberally salted with the type of things that English people like to hear. We actually think that a lot of Massachusetts slaves in the 18th century would have been at least semi-literate. Some of the early colonial laws require that slaves be able to read at least the Bible. How many of them would have been able to write is another statistic that we're still trying to chase down. if a slave can write, and if a slave is going to be writing about himself, you have to wonder if he's going to be writing for an audience or if he's going to be writing solely for himself. Is it going to be just an academic exercise for their own benefit, or is it going to be an attempt to try to communicate with other people? If it's just for themselves, you do have the possibility that they're setting down their unaltered thoughts. The things that are going through their head are being set down on paper. Unfortunately, it's not very likely that you're going to be able to find very many documents like this. Most of the narratives that I had to draw on, and Briton Hammon's narrative from 1760 itself, they were probably, if he wrote them himself, they were certainly edited by English people. If he didn't write them himself, you have to wonder how much the people who he was telling the story to, how much they actually edited the story to make it a little bit more palatable for an English audience. If you go through and you read the narrative, there are many instances where Briton will talk about the horrid Spanish, and they sold me as a slave. Why would they do that? And then he's liberated from the Spanish, and he goes back and he returns to slavery under John Winslow, and he says, all of a sudden I'm free. My captivity is over. I don't think he actually means that. So one of the big problems that I find is not only finding primary sources that talk about the types of things that you need to research if you're looking into the lives of Briton Hammon and other people like him, but also taking what they say with a grain of salt. Because it's unlikely that most of the things that they set down in these documents are going to be entirely what they think. You always need to wonder how much of these words have been altered to make what they're trying to say more palatable to the audience for which they're intended. So that's my biggest problem, just in finding these types of sources and also in trying to figure out how much you can actually trust these sources.
How about in researching prints?
Well, certainly the main resource I relied on were letters, and these were letters written to and from the Barneses. It's exactly the same situation as what Aaron mentions. You have to interpret what's being said in the letter and hear what's being said and decide how to read it. In one of Christian's letters, which is kind of fun, she was talking to a friend about how sober, diligent, and faithful Prince was. And then she wrote, I believe, as he was born in our family, that he is of Tory principles. But of that I am not quite so certain, as he has not yet declared himself. It'd be unlikely that Prince would be sharing his politics, and we know that as soon as the Barneses were on the boat, Prince had a different last name and was in the Massachusetts militia. So Christian guessed wrong, but we were able to flesh that out from other sources. Similarly, another letter that Henry writes from England, he's very concerned because he writes that he's afraid that the Prince is going to, quote, attempt his freedom. That while he's in England, he's going to run away, declare his freedom. This was the same year of what was called Somerset's case in England, which was a case about a person from the New World, from America, who had brought a slave with them to England. The slave tried to escape. The master caught the slave and tried to put the slave on a boat to the Barbados, which is where the bad slaves went. And he filed a writ for habeas corpus in the English courts, and Lord Mansfield ruled that on English soil there were no slaves, and that the master couldn't send Somerset to the Barbados. This had to be heady sort of things to hear about when you're in England studying painting with a great Whig political artist, and so you can read between the lines. Henry is clearly fretting about this, And so that's interesting. As to the places you look for the corroborating detail, church records, Massachusetts State Archives, the political records. For many slaves in the 18th century, the records of the absentee estates when loyalists went back to England, their estates were seized, which also sometimes included their slaves. And you find a lot of, that's how I found out about Prince's mother, who had a very long history in the court and with the general court about her support after the Barneses left. And military records. The Daughters of the American Revolution have put together a huge database called Forgotten Patriots, which is about the Black and Native American soldiers in the Revolutionary War. And you can also find Black soldiers by reading between the lines of the larger compendium, Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolutionary War, because they don't give race, but they give complexion. It just says light, dark, tawny. I mean, so you're sort of trying to go. But you can often get an idea of the race of the soldier. It was also very much the case in those days that enslaved African Americans often had classical names, and so your Catos and Aesops and or Bostons, Britons. So that's another good place to look.
So, are you continuing to? I'll start with you, Aaron. Are you continuing to look into Briton's life, and where do you think your research will lead you?
I am continuing to look into Briton's life. Eventually, I would like to try to develop his story into a book, because it sounds like something out of Pirates of the Caribbean, which, the movie did all right. I feel like a book that actually happened.
Screenplay.
Yeah, and that has the additional appeal of being from a minority group. You don't hear much about 18th century slaves in Massachusetts. It's not really a subject that gets a lot of screen time or a great deal of popular press, unfortunately. When I continue to do research on this, I'm hoping to find more primary sources. As I said earlier, that's one of the main obstacles that I have. When we were working on putting together logistics for this discussion here today, Paula actually pointed me in the direction of some documents that may relate to Briton later on in his life, when perhaps he may have moved to Hingham with his master John Winslow. That's something that I need to look into and try to figure out what other information is available on this. Do we perhaps have records that talks about Briton's early life or later life that have been in Massachusetts this whole time and they've never been uncovered or analyzed? So hopefully I'll be able to uncover a whole bunch of information about that. And if anybody ever looks around in your attic and you see something about the Winslows or Briton Hammon, please contact me, because I would love to hear about it.
How about Prince?
As long as you're up in your attics looking for things. The other thing you should keep your eyes out for is paintings that look like sort of Copleys with something wrong with them. Because I'm convinced that there are more paintings by Prince out there. If there were 2 in the Old Ordinary in Hingham, there could be 2 in anybody else's house or house museum as well. And I look, so that's one thing I want to do, is I want to get the word out for people to look, because these paintings probably aren't going to be at the National Portrait Gallery. They're going to be somewhere like in a local historical society. The other thing I want to spend some time trying to figure out is, what is the connection to Hingham? I know why the paintings are here, but there's this very direct connection, obviously, between Prince's mother and this town, and several families in this town. And as we mentioned, the Winslows and the Littles of Marshfield, who were big slave-owning families, are related to the Barkers of Hingham. And Christian Barnes in one of the letters. Somebody said, "Was it going to be expensive to take Prince all the way to England and back again?" And she said, "Well, yeah, but if it starts to get too expensive, Henry can always have him work his way over and back, since he's been around ships all his life." And they lived in Marlborough. So that suggests to me that it is a very good possibility that Prince may have grown up on the South Shore. That may be where these first 27 years or something that we don't know anything about yet, and so that would be kind of fun.
And finally, Aaron, how do you think Briton's story remains relevant and resonates today?
Well, it's a good example of the continuing need to try to bring to life some of these voices that have been around for decades that don't really get talked about all that much. Just by a show of hands, if you don't mind, how many people have heard of Briton Hammon before you came to the discussion today? A couple people. Okay, that's good. And we hope that eventually more people will hear about him. Unfortunately, a great deal of colonial history kind of focuses on the Washingtons, the Winslows, the Jeffersons, so on and so
The
forth.
Adamses.
The Adamses.
Oh,
yes. There's always the need to continue researching the experiences of people whose ancestors didn't come over on the Mayflower. I think that this is a goal that all historical societies are working on today, and I think it's a very good goal. So I believe that Briton's story not only continues to teach us about the way that different groups of people in the colonies would have lived their lives, it also teaches us that sometimes we need to dig a little bit deeper and try to find out if perhaps we overlooked something.
Great, thank you. And Paula, same thing with Prince's story. How does it resonate and remain relevant today?
Well, I'm pretty much going to repeat what Aaron said. I mean, one very interesting thing about Prince is that I do believe he is a game changer in terms of the study of African American art history. He appears to be the earliest documented visual artist who is black in this hemisphere, and that's a very interesting thing. But the richness of some of the material about him and the amount that we know about his life, I think, and hopefully we'll know more, helps us think about what I said before, which are relationships that are sort of truly hard for us to understand. And the family of the Barneses and the Barneses, they had no children of their own. They were raising a niece. They had a number of indentured servants, and they had a number of slaves working in various capacities. And there were all these people with differing familial and legal relationships to each other, all living under one roof. And it was a very different family, than our family today, and is something that merits a lot of study.
Thank you so much. And Aaron and Paula, thank you all very much again for coming.